There is a particular kind of silence that happens when something goes very, very wrong in a room full of people who all thought they were perfectly safe. I have experienced that silence exactly once in my life. It happened in Professor Draven Solis's classroom on the 14th floor of the Galactic Unified Training Academy on the station known as Vel'Korath on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning that turned out to be anything but ordinary. I should probably start from the beginning. Vel'Korath is not a glamorous posting. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or has never seen a glamorous posting. It is a mid-tier orbital training station sitting in the outer band of the Cathon system, staffed by instructors who are either brilliant and modest enough to avoid the more prestigious academies, or arrogant enough to believe that running a mid-tier station is somehow beneath them while simultaneously being too mediocre to get assigned anywhere better. Professor Draven Solis was firmly in the second category. He was Thesauri, which, if you are unfamiliar with the Thesauri, means he was tall, silver-skinned, had 4 fingers on each hand, and carried himself with the particular energy of a species that discovered faster-than-light travel roughly 800 years before most of the current galactic community, and had absolutely never, not even for one single moment, let anyone forget it. The Thesauri are not bad people. I want to be clear about that. I have known many Thesauri in my life, and most of them are perfectly reasonable, intellectually sharp, and even occasionally funny. Draven Solis was not most Thesauri. Draven Solis was the kind of instructor who walked into a room like he was doing the room a personal favor just by being present. He had a voice like polished stone, smooth and cold, and just sharp enough to cut if you pressed against it. He wore his academy rank insignia on both shoulders simultaneously, which was technically allowed by regulation, but which everyone understood was the academic equivalent of telling the entire universe to look at him. He taught advanced threat assessment and interspecies combat theory, which sounds impressive until you realize that roughly 60% of the course content was Draven explaining, in extensive and loving detail, why every species except the Thesauri had suboptimal threat responses, suboptimal physical conditioning, and suboptimal survival instincts. The other 40% was essentially the same argument with better diagrams. I was seated in the 3rd row on the first day of the new semester, next to my cohort mate Sivel, who is Drathani and who has approximately 7 more sensory organs than I do, and was therefore already deeply uncomfortable with the room's ventilation system before the class even began. I am Orath. We are not particularly impressive by galactic standards. 4 limbs, 2 eyes, a middling lifespan, and a homeworld with a comfortable threat index of 2.3. We are, as one of my professors once noted, extremely average in almost every measurable way. This did not bother me until I met the humans, but I am getting ahead of myself. The human cadets arrived 7 minutes late to the first session, which, in hindsight, should have told us something. Not because being late is impressive, it is not, but because they were late in a very specific way. They did not rush in looking panicked and apologetic the way most late cadets do. They walked in at a perfectly normal pace, found their seats without any apparent stress, and arranged their things with the calm, unhurried energy of people who had done the mental math on tardiness and concluded that 7 minutes was well within acceptable parameters. There were 3 of them. Mara Solis came in first. She was shorter than I expected, which I realize is a ridiculous thing to say since I had no particular expectation. But humans in the galactic media tend to be depicted either as enormous brutish creatures barely contained by their own skin, or as slight, fragile-looking beings who somehow survive things that should not be survivable, and Mara fit neither image cleanly. She was medium height, with dark hair pulled back from her face, wearing the standard Academy cadet uniform with both sleeves pushed up to the elbow. She had a datapad tucked under one arm and an expression that could only be described as quietly amused, as though she had already heard a joke that nobody else in the room had been told yet. Behind her came Juno Vetch, who was taller, with pale skin and a sharp, watchful face, and the particular posture of someone who has spent a great deal of time in environments where bad things can come from any direction and has simply accepted this as a baseline condition of existence. Juno moved like water, finding a path, smooth, efficient, slightly unsettling if you were paying attention. Last was Tal Brenner, who was broad-shouldered and had the kind of relaxed expression that either means someone is very stupid or very dangerous, and I was beginning to suspect, watching him lower himself into a seat in the back row with the ease of someone settling in for a nap, that it was not the first option. Draven watched them find their seats. Then he smiled. It was not a kind smile. "How generous," he said, in Galactic Standard, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "The human contingent has decided to grace us with their presence. 7 minutes late. I trust Earth Standard Time runs slightly slower than the rest of the galaxy." There was laughter from several cadets, a Vethari pair in the second row, 2 Skonari near the window. The laughter was polite but sharp, the kind designed to establish social geometry in a room full of strangers. Mara looked up at Draven. She smiled back. It was not a small smile. It was a full, genuine, entirely undefended smile, the kind that takes real confidence to produce when a room full of people is laughing at you. "Apologies, Professor," she said pleasantly. "We took a wrong turn at the junction on level 12. The signage on this station is interesting." "Interesting," Draven repeated. "Creative," she offered. He stared at her for a moment. Then, apparently deciding that continuing the exchange was beneath him, he turned back to the room and moved on. But I noticed that he did not stop watching the 3 of them. Not for the rest of that first class. The lecture on Deathworlders happened on the 3rd day of the semester, and it was, by general consensus, among the non-human cadets, who had been warned about it in advance by older students, a genuine performance. Draven did not just teach this lecture. He produced it. He had visual aids. He had citation reels. He had a 3-dimensional projection array that took up the entire front half of the room and displayed in crisp and beautiful detail every species currently carrying the classification of Deathworld origin in the Galactic Registry. He started with the Vorkai, because of course he did, and talked for 12 minutes about their physiological resilience, their pack cognition, their distributed nervous systems, and their genuinely impressive record of surviving conditions that had killed every other species that had ever encountered them. Then he moved through the Skethran tunnel crawlers, the Mulgari deep swimmers, and the Carven Ridge stalkers of Haxis IV, each one presented with the reverence of someone introducing legends. And then he got to Earth. He pulled up the display for the Sol system, and he stood back from it, and he looked at it, and then he looked at the room, and he smiled the smile of a man about to deliver a punchline he had been holding for 20 minutes. "And then," he said, "we have the humans." He let the word sit there for a moment. The humans, who come from a world with a threat index of 7.1, a world with extreme weather events, tectonic instability, a biosphere full of genuinely unpleasant creatures, and a history of almost continuous internal conflict. He paused. By the numbers, Earth should indeed produce apex survivors. The data suggests a species hardened by circumstance, sharpened by pressure, and forged by a genuinely challenging home environment. He clicked to the next display. And then you look at what humans actually are. The display showed a comparison chart. Human physical specifications against the confirmed Deathworlder species. Strength, speed, sensory range, cellular regeneration, venom resistance, thermal tolerance. Average, he said, pointing at column after column. Average. Below average in sensory range. Average. Below average in regeneration. Moderate thermal tolerance, which sounds impressive until you compare it to literally any species from a high-radiation homeworld. He turned to the room. The human Deathworlder reputation is, in the most polite terms available to me, the galaxy's longest-running and least examined myth. A story that got told often enough that people stopped asking whether it was actually true. He put his hands together and looked directly at the three human cadets. "You are not Deathworlders," he said pleasantly. "You are a mildly resilient species from a moderately challenging world who have benefited enormously from a very good galactic publicist." More laughter. Louder this time. Mara was looking at her datapad. She did not appear to be looking at the lecture material. She appeared to be making notes about something entirely unrelated. Juno was looking at the projection, calmly, with the expression of someone reviewing a document they already know contains errors and are simply cataloging where the errors are. Tal had his chin in his hand and was watching Draven with the patient, faintly interested expression of someone watching a small animal do something that it does not realize is funny. Draven finished his summary. He asked the room for questions. Mara raised her hand. She did not stand. She did not make a show of it. She simply raised her right hand, the way you do when you have a question, and the sleeve of her uniform slid back along her forearm. And that was when everything in the room changed. I saw Sivell go still beside me. I saw the Vethari pair in the second row turn to look at each other. I saw two cadets near the back, whose species I did not recognize, straighten up very suddenly in their seats. Because on Mara Solis's hand, running from the back of her knuckles up across the top of her wrist and disappearing under the pushed-up sleeve, there was a scar. Not just any scar. Not a surgical mark or an equipment burn, or the kind of generic damage that any active person accumulates over a life that involves moving through the physical world. This was a Vorkai mark. I knew it because we had just spent 12 minutes looking at images of Vorkai anatomy, and the pattern of a Vorkai apex-gripping limb with its distinctive trilateral pressure distribution and its hooked secondary anchors, leaves a mark that is, according to every piece of xenobiological literature ever written on the subject, essentially impossible to survive in a form that still has the limb attached. The scar was old, fully healed. The skin around it was smooth and continuous, which meant the underlying tissue had regenerated completely, which meant whoever had received this mark had been young enough, when it happened, that full cellular repair was still possible. Mara's hand was raised. Her expression was the same pleasant, faintly amused expression it had been since she walked in the door. Draven looked at her hand. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, in a voice that was perhaps very slightly less certain than it had been 30 seconds ago, he said, "Yes?" "I had a question about the classification criteria," Mara said. "Specifically the part about average regenerative capacity. The registry baseline for human regeneration is drawn from adult measurements, right? The adult figures are lower. But juvenile measurements, under age 14, put humans in the upper third of the Deathworlder regeneration band. I was curious whether the comparison chart accounted for that." Draven blinked. "The chart uses standard registry data," he said. "Right," Mara said. "So, adult figures. Okay, that makes sense." She lowered her hand. The sleeve stayed where it was, and the mark stayed visible, and nobody in the room had stopped looking at it. Just wanted to clarify. She went back to her datapad. The room did not go back to normal. Sivell leaned toward me and said, very quietly, in our shared secondary language so the humans would not hear, "Is that what I think that is?" "Yes," I said. "On her hand?" "Yes. She is still using the hand." "I am aware." There was a pause. "How old do you think she is?" Sivell whispered. 18. 19, maybe. Another pause. "So that happened when she was—" "Do the math," I said. Sivell did the math. I watched the color shift slightly in Sivell's secondary facial membrane, which is the Drathani equivalent of going pale. 12, maybe, I said. 13 at the outside. Draven had resumed talking. He was saying something about physiological baselines and documentation standards, and the importance of not extrapolating from edge cases, and his voice was still smooth and confident. But there was something happening underneath it now, a kind of careful maintenance, the sound of a person who is actively managing themselves. Mara was still writing notes. She was, I realized, writing with the hand that had the scar on it. She let him talk for another 4 minutes before she raised her hand again. This time, Draven paused for a fraction of a second before he acknowledged her. Just a fraction. But it was there. "Yes, Cadet Solis." "Sorry," she said. "One more thing. The slide you showed earlier on Vorkai Apex encounters. The survival statistics. Those were the general population figures, right? Not sorted by contact type?" "They are the standard registry figures." "Okay," she said, "because close contact survival versus observed at distance survival are categorized separately in the registry. The general population figures include observed at distance encounters, which brings the overall survival number up, but is kind of a different situation than actual physical contact." She tilted her head slightly. "I just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same thing." The room was extremely quiet. Draven looked at her. "Are you suggesting," he said slowly, "that you have personal experience with a Vorkai Apex close contact encounter?" Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her hand. Then she looked back at him. "I mean," she said gently, "the scar is pretty self-explanatory." Someone in the back row made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh, and then went very quiet. "That mark," Draven said, and his voice had acquired a new quality, not quite defensive, not quite uncertain, but somewhere in the territory between the two, "could have many sources." "It could," Mara agreed pleasantly, "but it doesn't." "And you were, 12 years old?" 12 and a half, she said, give or take. He stared at her. "And how," he said, "does a 12-year-old human survive close contact with a Vorkai Apex?" Mara considered the question with the expression of someone reviewing a moderately interesting memory. "Badly," she said. "And then fine." She told the story the way someone might describe a frustrating commute. There was no drama in her voice, no theater. She was not performing the story for the room. She was simply reporting it, the way you report facts, and somehow that made it so much worse. The colony was called Tethys Reach, a small mining settlement on the outer edge of the Mulgari Belt. Rough terrain, high mineral density, the kind of place that attracts the kind of people who prefer not to be easily found, which is a polite way of saying there were not many safety protocols and even fewer rescue response times worth mentioning. She was 12. 2 other kids were with her, both older, both of whom she described only as annoying and useful in that order. They had been near the eastern processing units when the Vorkai Apex came through the perimeter. It had been following the excavation sounds, she said, Vorkai apex are attracted to subsonic vibration patterns in the specific frequency range that mining equipment produces, which the colony knew. There were protocols. The protocols were not being followed that day because the supervisor was dealing with a separate equipment failure on the western side and made the reasonable but, in hindsight, incorrect call that the eastern perimeter was low risk. She paused to take a sip from her water container. The apex came through the fence at the weakest junction point, which was, coincidentally, the junction point closest to where we were. "And what did you do?" Draven asked. He had, I noticed, stopped pacing. He was standing still. He was listening. "Ran, initially," she said. "That is always the first step. Running is very underrated as a strategy, and I think the galactic community undersells it. But Vorkai apex are faster than humans in a straight line, so running buys you time, not safety. The safety has to come from something else." And what was the something else? This from a cadet in the second row, a sconery named Thesu, who had been laughing loudest at Draven's jokes 20 minutes ago and was now leaning forward in her seat. Mara looked at Thesu with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for the question. "There was a cable spool near the secondary processing unit," Mara said. "Industrial grade. About this high," she indicated with her unscarred hand. "Approximately 400 kilograms. One of the older kids, his name was Davo, was able to get it onto an incline by releasing the wheel lock. The incline pointed back toward the apex's path. The spool was not going to kill it. Vorkai apex are too structurally resilient for blunt force to be a realistic plan. But it was going to interrupt the pursuit long enough for us to get to the secondary access tunnel, which had a blast door." She paused. "The problem was the timing." "Naturally," I heard myself say, and then realized I had said it out loud. Mara glanced at me. She seemed pleased that I was following along. "Someone had to hold the apex's attention while Davo got the spool into position," she said. "The other kid, Ren, had a broken arm from falling during the initial run, so she was not able to do it. Davo needed both hands for the spool." "So," she lifted the scarred hand slightly. "I did it," she said. "You get the apex to focus on you by standing close enough to register as a priority target. The issue with standing close enough to register as a priority target is that sometimes the apex reaches you before you have finished registering." She said this with the same tone you might use to describe a scheduling conflict. "It got one grip before I cleared the range. Left hand. It held for approximately 2 seconds before the spool hit. I pulled free when the grip loosened. Made it to the tunnel. Blast door closed. We were inside." She set down her water container. "Davo had a dislocated shoulder from the spool effort. Ren had the broken arm. I had the hand. We were in the tunnel for about 6 hours before the extraction team got to us." Complete silence. "You were 12, said Thesu. 12 and a half, Mara said, "and you used yourself as bait." "I used myself as a distraction," Mara said, and there was a faint precision in the correction. The precision of someone who thinks about language. Bait implies you expect to be consumed. I expected to not be consumed, and I was not. Draven opened his mouth. Then he closed it. "That," Junovech said from the second row, in a voice that was perfectly level and completely uninvited, "is not even the most dangerous thing Mara has done." Every head in the room turned to look at Juno. Juno was sitting with both arms folded, looking at Draven with the particular expression of someone who has been patient for a long time and is now simply done being patient. "I am not saying this as a challenge," Juno said. "I am saying it because the discussion is about survival statistics, and if we are discussing survival statistics, The dataset should probably be accurate. Draven stared at Juno. "The most dangerous thing she has done," Draven said, and even he seemed to hear something hollow in his own voice as he said it. "On record," Juno said carefully. "The most dangerous thing on record." From the back row, without sitting up any straighter, Tal Brenner added, "There is a Tier 7 citation in the file if you want the paperwork." Draven's expression did a complicated series of things in rapid succession. "A Tier 7 citation," he said. He said it the way you might say something when you are repeating it back to yourself because you need the extra time to process the information. "Galactic Survival Registry," Tal confirmed, with the unhurried ease of someone confirming a dinner reservation. "Civilian classification. Issued by the Mulgari Belt Sector Authority approximately 4 years ago. If you want to pull the reference number, I can find it in about 30 seconds. He reached for his datapad without urgency. I turned to look at Sivelle. Sivelle was staring at the front of the room with the expression of someone who has arrived at a party expecting a moderately pleasant evening, and has instead walked into an event they are going to be describing to other people for the rest of their life. "A Tier 7, Sivelle whispered. "Yes," I whispered back. "The highest civilian survival rating in the registry." "Yes." "Issued to a then 14-year-old human girl." "Apparently." Sivelle made a very small, very controlled sound. Draven had not moved. Juno did not wait for an invitation to continue. "I grew up on a survey vessel," Juno said, in the same flat, informational tone. "My parents were contracted surveyors for the Catharan Deep Mapping Project. Deep survey vessels have small crews and large operational territories. The response time for emergency extraction in most of the sectors we worked was between 14 and 40 hours. The room was listening. Not to Draven anymore. To Juno. "I want to be clear that most of the time, nothing happens," Juno said. "Survey work is 90% routine. But the 10%, and here Juno paused very briefly, a single breath's worth of space in an otherwise even delivery, teaches you to take the 90% seriously, because you know exactly what the alternative looks like." Someone near the window, a Vethari cadet I did not know by name, said quietly, "What happened in the 10%? Juno looked at the cadet. "Various things," Juno said. "The relevant one is that I was 17 when we had a cascade failure in the environmental systems 3 days from the nearest relay station. Full crew of 6. 2 were incapacitated by the initial system shock. 1 was needed to maintain the navigation array manually, because the automated systems were part of the cascade failure. My mother was coordinating the distress signal. My father was doing external hull assessment in a suit with a compromised seal." Juno paused. "I ran the environmental restoration sequence alone. The manual sequence, not the automated version. The manual version takes 22 steps across 4 separate system panels and requires continuous cross-referencing because the systems interact with each other, and if you do them in the wrong order, you make things worse, not better. I had read the manual twice and never done it in a real scenario." Another pause. "I did it in 4 hours and 11 minutes. The standard benchmark for a trained 2-person team is 3 hours and 40 minutes. The room was very quiet. "I am not telling you this to be impressive," Juno said. "I am telling you this because the question on the table is whether humans belong in the Deathworlder category, and I think the data suggests that the category is not actually about physical specifications. It is about what a species does when the options are solve it or die. And humans," Juno said, with the faintest trace of something that might have been pride or might have been simple honesty, are very, very good at solving it. Draven had not moved in some time. I watched him. He was standing at the front of the room where he had been standing for the entire class, with his visual aids still glowing in the projection array behind him, and he looked like a man standing in a room that had quietly rearranged itself around him without asking his permission. Tal placed the datapad on the desk in front of him with a small, flat sound. Reference number is GT-7-MBS-442, he said. Mara Solis, civilian, Tier 7 citation, Mulgari Belt Sector. The citation summary is available in the public registry. Approximately 600 words. I would recommend it. He said this last part to no one in particular and everyone simultaneously. From the second row, a cadet I later came to know as Vreth, a Kathrani who had been among the loudest laughers at Draven's Earth jokes, raised his hand. Not to ask Draven a question. He looked at Mara. "What was the Tier 7 for?" Vreth asked. Mara looked at Tal. Tal looked at Mara. A very brief and entirely silent conversation passed between them. The kind of conversation that two people who have known each other for a long time can have without speaking. "The full version is in the citation," Mara said. "The short version is that there was a secondary Vorkai event at Tethys Reach when I was 14. Not an apex, a nesting group, which is," she said, with the tone of someone selecting words carefully, "a different problem." "Different how?" Vreth asked. "An apex is one animal," Mara said. "A nesting group is an apex, a territorial secondary, and between 4 and 9 juveniles, all of whom are defending a fixed point and will not disengage for any reason short of a confirmed perimeter breach on the opposing side." Absolute silence. "There were people trapped on the wrong side of the nesting perimeter," Mara said simply. "So we needed to create a confirmed perimeter breach on the opposing side." "We," said Vreth. "Davo again," Mara said. "And 2 adults this time, which helped. And better equipment. We had proper cable anchors by then, not just a loose spool." She paused. "It still took 11 hours. "And you were 14, said Vreth. 14 and 3 months, Mara said. Vreth leaned back in his seat and looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the manner of someone recalibrating their entire understanding of several things simultaneously. Draven spoke. His voice was steady. I will give him that. It was steady and measured, and carried all the surface confidence of a man who had not just watched his entire lecture be quietly dismantled from the 3rd row by a human girl with a healed scar on her hand. Surviving specific encounters, he said, however dramatic, does not constitute species-wide evidence. Edge cases exist in every population. The presence of exceptional individuals does not redefine the category. Mara looked at him. It was a long look. Not hostile, not amused, quite. Something more patient than either of those things. You're right that edge cases exist, she said. I'm not arguing that every human is me. I wouldn't make that claim. She tilted her head slightly. But I would like to ask you something. Ask, he said. In the Thesari survival record, she said, how many close-contact Vorkai Apex encounters are documented? Any classification? Any outcome? Draven's jaw tightened slightly. The Thesari are not a Deathworld species, he said. The comparison is not relevant. I'm not comparing, Mara said gently. I'm asking, just the number. Any close-contact encounters. Any outcome at all. The number was in the public registry. Every cadet in the room could pull it in under 15 seconds. Several of them already were. The number was 0. No recorded close-contact Vorkai Apex encounters in the entire Thesari species history. Not because the Thesari were cowards, not because they were unintelligent or poorly equipped, but because the Thesari, like almost every other species in the galaxy, had correctly assessed the Vorkai apex and made the reasonable, sensible, survival-oriented decision to never, under any circumstances, get close to one. The Thesari had good judgment. Mara Solis, at 12.5 years old, had been standing in a situation where good judgment was a luxury she could not currently afford, and she had handled it. Draven looked at the room. The room looked back at him. I watched him understand, in real time, that he had already lost the argument. Not because Mara had raised her voice, or challenged him dramatically, or done anything except sit in the third row, answer his questions, and tell him, in a completely ordinary tone of voice, exactly what had happened to her hand and why it looked the way it did. He had not lost the room to a confrontation. He had lost it to a Tuesday. "Class is dismissed," Draven said. "Read the supplemental material on the registry taxonomy for next session." He turned off the projection array. He gathered his materials. He left the room with the brisk, purposeful stride of a man who has somewhere to be, which is what you do when you need everyone to believe you are not leaving, because you need to leave. The door closed behind him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Vreth turned fully around in his seat to look at Mara. 14 and 3 months, he said, like he was confirming it one more time. Mara smiled at him. The same smile from the doorway, when she walked in. The one that knew something the room had not been told yet. 14 and 3 months, she confirmed. I have thought about that class many times since that day. Not just because of the scar, or the Tier 7 citation, or the way Draven Solis walked out of his own lecture as though the room had done something to him personally. I think about it because of how ordinary Mara was about all of it. She was not angry. She did not need him to be wrong. She did not perform any of it for our benefit. She asked a question about classification criteria and happened to be holding a hand that told a story he had not accounted for. And when he pushed, she simply described what had happened, in the same voice you might use to describe a commute. And that was enough. That was more than enough. The galaxy has a story it tells itself about humans. Some people, like Draven, believe the story is exaggerated. Some people believe it is true. Most people have not actually stopped to ask why the story exists, which is the more interesting question. The story exists because humans, when placed in a situation where the options are solve it or die, do not appear to perform a standard threat assessment and arrive at a rational conclusion about whether the situation is survivable. They appear to simply start solving, without consulting the statistics, without checking the registry survival rates, without, apparently, fully registering that the correct number of close-contact Vorkai apex encounters that a 12-year-old should be accumulating is 0. I do not know if that makes them brave. I do not know if brave is even the right word for something that appears to operate below the level of deliberate decision-making, somewhere in the part of a species that acts before the thinking part has had a chance to weigh in. What I know is that after that class, I stopped thinking of the human Deathworlder reputation as a myth or a fact. I started thinking of it as a warning,